Hey guys, my name is Chris.
And my name is Kellyanne, and we're so excited that you guys joined us today. If you're new or you still feel like you're new here at Mountain Springs, we have such an exciting opportunity coming up called First Step, where you get to come and learn more about the church, about our vision and mission of the church, get to hear from our leadership and find out serving opportunities and just find out what Mountain Springs is about. So if you're interested in that, you can find out more information under the events tab on our MSC app.
And we're real excited for the message today. We've got a guest speaker with us, Steve Cuss. He's a longtime friend of Mountain Springs Church. He's an author, he's a pastor, and just has a heart for people. And we get to hear today in our gospel series that we're going through on that iconic moment shortly after the resurrection where Jesus meets two of his disciples on the road to Emmaus. But before we dig into the message today, let's worship.
My hope is brick by brick will come down. Your light will shine, lifting me out of the shadows. Here and now, I know where my breakthrough's found. Yeah. So I'm gonna sing my way out of the valley. I'm gonna shout my way up to the mountain. I will take hold of the truth of your promise, and I'm gonna praise, I'm gonna praise, and I'm gonna push through till every lie crumbles. I'm gonna dance in the midst of the rain. I'm gonna rest in the arms of the Father. I'm gonna praise your
All right, good evening, Mountain Springs. Some of us have met before, some of us have never met. My name's Steve Cuss. My last name is Cuss. I know there's kids in the room. There's nothing we can do about it. That's my name. So there it is. I just want you to know a couple of things. As Chris said, I love this church. And I love what God is doing in and through this church. This really is a remarkable community. I don't say that everywhere I go, to be honest. I never tell a church I don't like them. But what Mountain Springs really is a unique community of God. What God is doing in this church, also the way God is using this church to impact this community is profound. And yes, I am a huge fan of your lead pastor. Daniel is a dear friend of mine. I think you're in amazing hands with him and Lori. So what a privilege for me to be here with you today. Hey, I didn't grow up in the church. I was an unchurched kid, completely secular family. But I did start following Jesus when I was a teenager. I was reached through a youth group. I've been following Jesus now for about 3 decades, a bit more than 3 decades. And I've come to the conclusion that there's only one way I know to follow Jesus, imperfectly. I'd like to confess right out of the gate that even as a pastor, I often have trouble seeing Jesus. Like, it's really remarkable how many different dynamics can be going on in my life that block my capacity to see Jesus. And even when Jesus is right beside me. Have you ever had this happen before? Like, we believe that those of us who are followers of Christ, the bedrock of our faith is God is with us. But, how many times have you gone through a whole day when maybe something's going on in your life, or either you've got a hold of something or something has a hold of you, and you're all stirred up, and you really have trouble seeing Jesus? Some people see Jesus quite easily and clearly, but for me, it's been a challenge most of my adult life. Now, fortunately for me, and if you're in the same boat, fortunately for you, there's precedent for this in the Bible. We're going to be okay. And I know we're in a series on John, and we've celebrated the resurrection, but we're going to give John the night off. We're going to move over to Luke, and Luke is our historian for this story, and the context is Resurrection Sunday. Today, in this story, is Resurrection Sunday. Jesus has been betrayed, tortured, crucified, he died, and he's risen from the dead, but only a couple of women know that. The big disciples, Peter, James, and John, they don't know that yet. In fact, almost all the disciples don't know that. They still think he's dead. And so our story picks up in Luke chapter 24. We start with verse 13. It'll be on the screen, and of course you can turn to it as well. Here's what Luke says. Now, that same day, 2 of them, those disciples, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they were talking with each other about everything that had happened. And as they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" By the way, there's this wonderful book by a Bible scholar named Conrad Gempf, and the book is called Jesus Asked. It's all the questions that Jesus asked people. My favorite chapter of the book, when Jesus pretends to not know the answer. It's great. "What are you guys talking about as you walk along?" And they stood still, and their faces were downcast. And one of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" I'll translate. "Are you a moron or something?" "What things?" Jesus asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people." Okay, who is this guy Cleopas? Like, you've heard about the disciples. You probably have even heard of a guy named Thaddeus. But Cleopas, we've never heard of this guy before. And Luke doesn't give us much to go on. Here's the thing for tonight. I'm not particularly interested in Cleopas. I'm fascinated, however, by his unnamed companion. Luke never tells us her name or his name. We don't know. Mrs. Cleopas, maybe. Or maybe it's a friend. Luke doesn't say. There's a lot of debate among Bible scholars about Cleopas's companion, but ultimately none of them know. I think I know. I don't mean to be arrogant, but I think I know who it is. I think everyone in this room knows who it is because Luke gives us a little clue. Luke says they were kept from recognizing Jesus. What kept them from recognizing Jesus? The short answer is God kept them from recognizing Jesus because God does that when God has a mind to. Maybe. But maybe it was something else. Maybe this would be a clue. What keeps you from recognizing Jesus even when Jesus is standing right beside you? Some scholars say, I'm not making this up, some Bible commentators say, the reason they didn't recognize Jesus is the sun was in their eyes. Come on. Okay, Emmaus is a 7-mile walk northwest of Jerusalem. It's late afternoon. The sun was low in the sky. It created kind of a glare, and maybe they didn't recognize Jesus because they couldn't see him. Maybe it is awfully difficult to recognize Jesus when the circumstances around you block your sight of him. That's why I think Cleopas' companion might have been Gehazi. Gehazi. Have you ever heard of Gehazi? He's a pretty obscure guy. It's a great name for a cat, by the way. If you ever have a cat, I personally think that's the perfect name for a cat. Gehazi, if you're not familiar with him, he was Elisha's intern in the Old Testament. Do you remember Elisha and Naaman and the dipping in the Jordan and all of that? And Naaman gets healed. Remember that? Like leprosy. And Naaman doesn't want to dip in the Jordan. He's a fancy king. And he's like, I'm not going to do that. And then Naaman's assistant's like, just do it already, dude. What's the problem? 7 times is not much. So he does it and he gets healed. And he says to Elisha, send me the invoice. And Elisha says, invoice for a healing? What are you, nuts? It's free of charge, the grace of God. And they leave. And then Gehazi goes back later and says, actually, it's $1,000. He was a scoundrel, Gehazi. You can read about him in your own time. But the story I'm interested in is he's Elisha's intern, and they're out, and they're surrounded by the Aramean army. It's just Elisha and Gehazi, and thousands of Arameans had their camp surrounded. And Elisha's completely calm about the situation, but Gehazi is soiling his pants. He's terrified because he cannot see that God is with him because of the circumstances around him. It's an amazing moment. You can look this up in your Bible, where Elisha puts his hand on Gehazi and prays for him and says, Lord, please show my servant what you have shown me. And God peels back the curtain of heaven. And around the Aramean army is an angel army. Enemy is surrounded. They're going to be okay. It is hard to see God when your circumstances are so clear. Maybe Cleopas' companion was Gehazi. Some scholars say that after the resurrection, Jesus looked different. Have you ever heard this? Like, why is it that so many people didn't recognize Jesus after the resurrection? Scholars say, look, the most simple explanation is he just looked very different than he did before he was crucified. His post-resurrection body looked different. And there's several occasions where people get mistaken. Do you remember Mary at the tomb? She rushes into the tomb, and the tomb is empty, and the grave clothes are folded neatly. The Bible author, I think it's John, that records that the grave clothes are actually folded neatly in the tomb, which goes to show that cleanliness is in fact next to godliness, as it turns out. Like, who knew? And she comes out of the empty tomb, and she's trying to figure out who stole Jesus, and she goes to the gardener. Do you remember that? And she says to the gardener, hey, have you seen Jesus? But it turns out that the gardener is Jesus. Now, John loves a good metaphor. That's why in Genesis 1, in the beginning, John starts his gospel. In the beginning, John's gospel is a creation account. And Jesus' public ministry is his creation, and then he finishes his toil and labor on the cross. The curse of the Garden of Eden reversed on the cross. And then resurrection, the Garden of Eden 2.0. He is toiling in the garden. That's why Mary confused him for the gardener. Maybe that's what's going on here. Sometimes God shows up very differently than you would expect. He looks so different than you thought he would. That's why I wonder if Cleopas' companion was named Sarah. Do you remember Sarah in the Old Testament? 90 years of age. One of the things she really wanted more than anything else is just to have a baby. And she's now decades past child-rearing years, and God shows up to Abraham. But God doesn't show up the way you'd expect God to show up. God shows up as 3 visitors. Do you remember that? They kind of look like angels, but they're kind of humans. And basically, God, in this 3-person visiting situation, says to Abraham, hey, that Social Security check, you're going to need to budget for some diapers, buddy. Now, when Daniel's here on Sunday, I'm going to change the word diapers to nappies, just as a gift to him. Anyway, Sarah heard it, and she laughed and laughed and laughed. She was laughing in God's face. That's considered rude behavior. Now, of course, Sarah was not at the meeting. She was eavesdropping in the tent. She had a little glass right up to the tent cover, listening in, taking it all in, and she heard God say to Abraham that she was going to be a mum at 90 years of age, and God caught her laughing, and God said to Sarah, "Why are you laughing?" And she said, "I didn't laugh." And God said, "Yes, you did too laugh." And that laugh combined with the wrinkles on her face to generate something that Sarah had lost decades ago, a twinkle in her eyes. And there she is, third trimester in, carrying all 10 pounds of the baby in her belly, reading glasses, hip replacement, adding salt to her food. And she gives birth to a baby boy, and she names him Isaac, which means laughter. It's very difficult to recognize God when God acts so preposterously. And it's very difficult to recognize God when God has done a miracle in the past, but it's been a while. And your hope fund is low. I wonder if the reason Cleopas and his companion didn't recognize Jesus is because one of them was on the run. It can be difficult to recognize Jesus or God when you are running as fast as you can away from your problems. I used to be a pastor in Las Vegas, and people would move there from the Midwest. When they got into trouble in the Midwest, they'd move to Vegas believing that all of their problems were left behind, not realizing that Vegas is the fastest zip code in America to get yourself in trouble. It can be hard to recognize God when you're running away from your problems. Maybe Cleopas' companion was Jacob. You remember Jacob? Sarah's grandson, by the way. Colluded with his mother, dressed up to look and smell just like his brother. One of the greatest compliments all in the Bible. Ladies, if you're ever going out on a date, you could try this on the guy. The smell of that man is like the smell of the field. That's how they described Esau. That's in the Bible. Esau, one of those guys, he needed more deodorant. Anyway, Jacob cheats Esau out of what is rightfully his, colludes with his mother, and bold-faced lies to his dying father. What a scoundrel. Can God bless a scoundrel? Can God bless? Doesn't God read his own Bible? Doesn't the book of Proverbs say that bad company corrupts good character? And yet God seemed to be quite comfortable spending time with Jacob. So Esau finds out about it and threatens to kill Jacob. And now Jacob is on the run, and he runs to his uncle's house and marries his first cousin. This sermon does not have enough time to deal with that. But it's in the Bible, so it must not be a sin. I don't know how that works. But on the way to Laban's house, Jacob stops for the night, and the author of Genesis says he uses a stone for a pillow, and God ascends down the stairway to heaven and meets Jacob in this profound, it wasn't a dream, it was a real encounter, and Jacob wakes up and he confesses the prayer of the anxious person. Surely the Lord was in this place, and I was not aware of it. Some of you might know, some of you might not know that I spend a lot of my time going into organizations and helping them manage anxiety in the workplace. And one of the surefire things that anxiety does is it displaces your awareness of God. It's very hard to be filled with anxiety and aware of God, and it's very hard to be aware of God and still filled with anxiety. Cleopas and his companion were struggling. Everything they had hoped for was dashed when Jesus was crucified. Like every other follower, they never anticipated the resurrection. They weren't standing outside the tomb counting down from 10 to 1 like a NASA launch expecting Jesus to come out. They were in an emotional state of despair. Sometimes it's despair that can block us from noticing God. I wonder if Cleopas' companion was actually the prophet Jeremiah. Have you ever read Jeremiah, that amazing prophet of the Old Testament, that depressed prophet? I couldn't believe that God let it get in the Bible, and I'm so glad he did. When Jeremiah one day was so depressed he didn't want to live anymore, and he said, "Cursed be the day I was born, and cursed be the man that left the birthing room to proclaim the good news of my birth. Cursed be him as well." That is despair. Fred Craddock says, I thought wherever Christ is, there's no misery, but now I realize that wherever there is misery, there Christ is. Maybe Cleopas' companion was Elijah. Do you remember Elijah where he tackled Ahab on the mountain? They had a showdown between the gods. It was a great moment where Elijah is actually taunting Ahab's God for being too long in the bathroom. Maybe your God's on the toilet, Elijah's saying. Listen, you got to read your Bibles. You wouldn't believe some of the stuff that's in there. And Elijah's God shows up in such a spectacular fashion. Ahab's God is asleep at the wheel, and Elijah wins. And then the next morning, Jezebel puts out a contract on Elijah's life. And even though God had showed up the day before, the next day, Elijah's spiritually depleted. Have you ever had that happen where you had this incredible encounter with God? Maybe you've gone to camp, and it just feels like God is so close, and then you come back and you're like, where's God? Where's God? And Elijah went into a profound despair, and so he did what you often do. He self-isolated. He moved away. Do you have a friend? Do you know someone who does this? They move away, they go far away, and then they pop their head up and they say, where is everybody? When they're the ones that moved. And so he moves far away into isolation, and then he says to God, where is everybody? And God comes to him with a question. God says, what are you doing here, Elijah? Sometimes the most profound moments with God are when God asks us questions. For example, when Jesus says, do you want to be well? To the invalid of 38 years. And I got to think the invalid's saying, you know, it has crossed my mind a time or two. 38 years. Do you want to be well? What kind of question is that? I'm 51 years old. By the way, I've been moisturizing my face now that I'm getting older. My wife went to Sephora and she got me all these products. So I understand I don't look 51. I get carded. I haven't been carded in years. Look at this dewy face. Look at these dewy features. Okay. Jesus says to the invalid, do you want to be well? 38 years an invalid. I think the answer is yes, but 51-year-old Steve, I'm still holding on to some of my proclivities that I actually don't want to give to God. Do you want to be well? Jesus also asked another great question. What do you want from me? How comfortable are you telling Jesus what you want? That's a bold and vulnerable thing to do. And of course, his question to Elijah, what are you doing here? I wonder if Cleopas' companion was Thomas. That's more likely. They were actual contemporaries. The other ones, less likely maybe. Thomas. Because I think doubt can sometimes block your awareness of God. Thomas's name in the Aramaic is Didymus. And kind of like Cleopas, it's a mystery because Didymus, it means twin. Twin. In the Aramaic, Didymus is Thomas's nickname. His name is Thomas, but Jesus nicknamed him the twin. But the people in the Bible never tell us who his twin is. We don't know who Thomas's twin is. And there's two possibilities. Some people say it's because he looked so much like Jesus. That's pretty cool. But I wonder if kind of like Cleopas' companion is a Rorschach test for our faith, where there's room for us to be Cleopas' companion. I also wonder if we might also be Thomas's twin. Unless I put my finger in his wounds and my hand in his side, I will not believe. Doubt can deepen your faith. Doubt can absolutely deepen your faith, but sometimes it can be very scary, especially when you're deconstructing, especially when you don't know what to stand on and what you can know for sure. Maybe Cleopas was traveling with Martha, who was worried about so many things, was always in a hurry. How many of you live your life with too many things to do at any given day? How many of you have gone to bed at night and said, I did well today, rather than, oh, there's so much more to do. It can be so difficult when we intentionally put so much on our plate to recognize Jesus. Now, of course, to be utterly fair to all of these people, Luke clearly tells us that the reason they didn't recognize him is that they were kept from recognizing him. Could it really be that God himself occasionally orchestrates his own perceived absence for some greater reason? But here's why I love this story. The blindness of the two disciples does not keep Christ from coming to them. They may not see Christ, but Christ sees them. Anytime that you are struggling to really see God, you can relax into the presence of God, knowing that you may not see God, but God sees you. He does not limit his post-resurrection appearance to those with full confidence in him. He comes to the disappointed, the doubtful, the wounded, the fearful. And so, here's one of my favorite parts of the story. Not knowing that they're in the very company of Jesus, they begin to tell him all about himself and all that had happened to him. They talk about the trial and the crucifixion and the odd testimony of the women that someone had stolen Jesus' body. I wonder if this journey to Emmaus helps understand the way prayer works. We're walking along our journey of life. We're unsure how to make sense of things, and Jesus comes and joins us in our uncertainty, but we're not aware that he's with us, and he invites us to bring our thoughts to him, and then we proceed to tell Jesus everything that Jesus already knows. If you struggle to pray, or if you would describe your prayer life like the Colorado Rockies baseball record, not great, then as good a way to start as any is to tell God what God already knows. Lord, I'm tired. I know. Lord, I'm afraid. I know. Lord, I'm a failure. Lord, help me. Lord, help my friend. The beauty of this encounter is while it begins with the despair of these companions, it certainly doesn't end there, because when they arrive in Emmaus, Jesus feigns like he's going to keep on walking, but they beg him to stay with them for the night. And this is where Jesus takes action. Luke 24, verse 30, when he was at the table with them, he took bread and he gave thanks and he broke it and he began to give it to them. And then their eyes were opened and they recognized him. And he disappeared from their sight. They eat a meal, and Luke records this fascinating phrase, then their eyes were opened. It's not the kind of language Luke usually uses in his gospel. It's very intentional language. Then their eyes were opened. That's familiar, that a couple of people eat a meal and then their eyes were opened. Does that ring any bells with you? This isn't the first time that someone has eaten a meal and had their eyes open. Did Luke use this on purpose to trigger a memory? Think of the very first meal ever recorded in the Bible. Genesis 3. The woman took some of the fruit and she ate it, and she gave it to her husband and he ate it, and then the eyes of both of them were opened and they knew that they were naked. That is the moment that shame entered the world. That is the moment that sin entered the world. That's the moment that death entered the world. Everything we just mentioned, every possible companion of Cleopas, every struggle that human beings face is evidence that we live in a world of death and difficult circumstances. And not recognizing God when he is with you, fear and sin and doubt and depression and isolation, being discarded and mistreated by other people, all of that entered our world through the portal opened by death at a meal when people's eyes were opened. And now here is Luke, echoing that story, but he's showing us how Jesus renews what is worn out. Jesus redeems what is broken. He offers a meal, the first meal of a new creation, the first meal of some stumbling disciples, and Jesus does it right after he conquers death, when the old world is fading and the new world starts crashing in. He took the bread, he blessed it, he broke it, and he gave it to them. And the eyes of both of them were opened and they recognized him. The couple at Emmaus discover that the long curse has now been broken. Death itself has been defeated. I love the way John the Revelator says it in the book of Revelation. The last enemy is defeated, and the last enemy is death. God's new creation, brimming with life and joy and new possibility and hope, has burst upon this world of decay and sorrow. And so we no longer need to stay in our fear and our anxiety and our shame. We no longer have to run away or self-isolate. Even when we're mistreated, it no longer gets the last word. We'll still experience all these things, but they don't have a death grip on us like they used to. And their power is diminished because their source is death. And in Christ, death has been struck dumb. Have you ever noticed, if you've ever lost a loved one, how death has a lot to say? It just natters on and on and on, making us afraid and making us feel robbed. And then it leaves like it had the final word. Death is so arrogant. It takes something from us, it kind of curses us, and then it takes off and says, there, that's the end of the matter. And then Jesus says, wait just a minute. I have another word. He says to death, silence. Death no longer gets the last word. Now the word after death is life. The word after death is light. The word after death is love. In Christ, you are a new creation. The old is gone and the new has come. And so finally, after Jesus prepares this meal and their eyes are open, we get their wonderful response. They asked each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked to us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? They had a clue. They had a clue that something more than just themselves was there. This burning heart, this profound hunger to know Christ, the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his suffering. Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked to us? Were not our hearts burning while he was on the journey with us? And so a fellowship was born that day. The fellowship of the burning hearts. It's a fellowship that's open to any disciples who struggle to see God when God is right by your side. It's full of sinners and saints and reprobates and a lot more preachers than you're willing to admit it. The founding members of this fellowship, they're a pretty diverse group of people. They don't all get along with each other. Cleopas and Sarah and Jacob and Hagar and Jeremiah and Elisha and even Thomas still pointing his finger in doubt. It's a fellowship of people who are on a journey, maybe in despair, maybe doing well, but all hungry for God to make sense of things and to show us that he's with us in it all. This fellowship of the burning hearts, it's an open membership. Anyone can join. It all began with Cleopas and his companion. The road to Emmaus was the inaugural meeting. There have been untold countless meetings since. It's open to anyone. A few decades ago, I decided to join. How about you? Can I give them your name?
Well, what a great message we heard today from Steve Cuss. We would love for you to join us next weekend as we wrap up our final message in our series on the book of John.